Welcome to the Beebe Library's Beach Reads program for the summer of 2017. I'm here with the rest of the reference staff. My name is Leanne Ellis. I'm a Reader's Advisory Librarian, and this is Karen Stern, who is she does our programming, Beth Radcliffe, who does our homebound delivery, Jeff Klebs, who's the head of the reference department, and Jackie Powers, who is head of our PR. And we all work together every summer and actually through the entire year trying to come up with suggestions for readers. That's one of the things we love doing more than anything else, is talking about books. So that's what we're going to do today. So we're going to begin by talking with Karen about her list.
Okay, this time my list is kind of about master storytellers and world builders. And it was inspired by two books I read this year that I really loved. One was Neil Gaiman's American Gods, and the other is N.K. Jemisin's The Fifth Season, which I'm actually going to talk about later. And I really loved both books for the kind of rich tapestries that they wove. And I couldn't really figure out why I felt that they were similar. I kept thinking there's something about these books that are linked, and it took me a while to realize what it was. But it came to me that they are both these sort of master storytellers and world builders. In addition to that, they both draw from many genres. So. That's what makes each story and each world unique. Each of the books on the list can have strong elements of any of the following genres: mystery, fantasy, historical fiction, science fiction, magical realism, speculative fiction, romance, or mythology. And the beauty of these books is that these genres coexist in a way that asks us to kind of put away labels and not put them in boxes, and just to listen to a story like nothing else you've ever heard in a place like nowhere you've ever been. And so the first book that I want to talk about today is called Annihilation by Jeff Vandermeer. And this book seems to have kind of split its community of readers in half. You kind of either love it or you hate it. Critics certainly loved it. It was the winner of the 2015 Nebula Award for Science Fiction and the 2014 Shirley Jackson Award for Horror. And that gives you kind of an idea of the genres that he's drawing on here. By the way, that mix has a name. It's called The New Weird, and Vandermeer's actually written a book on it. I had some mixed feelings about it myself at first. I didn't want to put it down, but I wasn't really sure if I loved it. Later, I read a review where someone said it was not an invasion. It did not attack my brain, insistent that I continue reading. I was not forced by fear to discover if the hero lives. My limbic system did not spike me with adrenaline until I finished. Instead, slowly, phrase by phrase, the story moved into my head, and that is exactly what happened to me with this book. The story is about a mysterious region called Area X, a major character in the book, and it's documented in great scientific detail by the other main character, who is the biologist. She's in Area X on the 12th expedition to this mysterious region, and all of the other previous expeditions have have ended with scientists either never returning or returning never to be the same again. So beyond sci-fi and horror, we can add mystery to the genres that Vandermeer adds to this mix. There are lots of questions like what has killed or stolen the souls of all the members of the previous expeditions, and why is it that the biologists and her crew can't remember their entry into Area X, and what is the strange, throbbing, glowing fungi that crawls down the wall of this tunnel that they are exploring. So there's all these questions, some of which are answered, some of which are not. But this is the first in a trilogy, so there will be places for the questions to be answered. But those questions will keep you going, as will her slightly strange narration style, slightly odd, antiseptic kind of narration style, which makes you realize that her humanity and her emotions are desperately trying to struggle out from underneath this personality that is obsessed with scientific observation and objectivity. And so that slow reveal of her personality is another thing that kept me reading.
Can you compare this to anything, Karen? Anything that...
The best thing I compare it to really is the TV series Lost. Again, something either people loved or hated. Another one would be The Martian, which, if you remember, had a lot of scientific detail in it. It was also about a character who was very isolated in a faraway place. There's Anne Hallam's Dr. Franklin's Island, if anyone's familiar with that young adult novel. It's generally for people who like creeping horror, psychological thrillers, and a really detailed sense of place. I think one of the reviewers called it biopunk. I kind of like that description of it too. But definitely, if you're not careful, it will take over your brain like that fungi crawling down the walls and move into your head.
Well, when you first talked about this earlier this month, my first question was, are the other books in the series already out? And they are. And of course, I read the book on your recommendation and immediately ran out and got the other two. So within the last 2 weeks, I plowed through all three of them.
So it's crept into your brain.
Yeah,
It's totally crept into
I
your
love
brain.
them. I'm one of the people who really, really like them.
On the love side.
Yeah.
Good.
But they are creepy.
Yeah, totally creepy. So that's Annihilation by Jeff Vandermeer. And I think now we move on to Jackie.
Yes. So this year I decided to use Beach Reads to get the word out about one of our newer collections, the Discovery Collection. We started it last October. It just has right now about 60 books in it, and they live on the display by the Avon Street entrance. The basic premise of the collection is to help the reader discover something new. A new author, a new perspective, a new culture, a new place. The authors featured here aren't high-demand bestsellers. You're not going to find them on our buzz table yet, where all the hot new books live. But they might end up there. So think of them as sort of before the buzz books. So what's included in the collection? It is weighted a little heavily toward fiction, but there are some nonfiction titles mixed in. There's short stories, there's essays, there's poetry. Everything does shade a little more literary than anything else. You're not going to find Janet Ivanovich type writing in the Discovery Collection. Her books, don't get me wrong, are fantastic and fun. I've read all of them. But no one is comparing Stephanie Plum to Tolstoy anytime soon, and I think these shade a little closer to Tolstoy. So, which kind of brings me to my next point. Many of the titles on our buzz table, on our bestseller table, got on those bestseller lists because of readers' relationship to an attachment to the series or to the characters. It doesn't make them necessarily better or worse than any other book, but it does make them more approachable. Regular readers of Michael Connelly or aforementioned Janet Ivanovich really know what they're getting into when they pick up one of those books. They already have a relationship with the character. With Discovery, we're sort of asking you to take a chance on the unknown and sometimes the unusual. We're calling it a collection for readers who choose the road less traveled. So the way we chose the books in this collection was to really kind of scour the internet for well-reviewed titles, but by unknown authors. Many of these turn out to be foreign authors who are really popular in their home countries but haven't really made the leap into the US market. Then we checked to see if other libraries in the network owned them. If everybody had bought it, we skipped it on the assumption that Jeff or Leanne would purchase it for their respective collections. We also got many helpful lists from Leanne from books that she was sort of on the fence about that looked like they might be good but may get lost in the shuffle that is general, new fiction. So I'll be back popping in and out with a couple more titles. For now, I'll leave you with one that is a good example of a book that crossed over from Discovery to a little more mainstream. It's called The Woman Next Door by Yewande Omatoso. The author is born in Barbados and based in South Africa. The book takes place in South Africa, and it's about two elderly, not-so-friendly neighbors who are forced into cohabitation. Children, marriage, money, race, forgiveness, and ownership all play a part in the story of relationships and reconciliation. I actually highly recommend the Woman Next Door if you liked maybe a man called Ova. So that's it for now, but I'll be back. And now we're on to Beth.
So I've always been greatly struck by books whose themes involve cultural disconnect, that is, misunderstanding each other because of different perspectives. So the mindset of those within a culture in contrast to those outside of the culture, and vice versa. For a very simple example, in our culture, blue is mostly associated with boys, and pink is mostly associated with girls. It's changed a little bit, but let's just go with that. So what happens when that hits up against a culture where it's the opposite? Misunderstanding, surely, confusion, expansion of one's views. Novels that explore that disconnect, that friction, that's what fascinates me. The clash, the misunderstandings, and the poignancy of those misunderstandings. Because isn't that a magnification of smaller disconnects on a personal level? These books to me are a piece of art because they must embrace both cultures in order to portray the divide. My list is of such books, but they're not limited to difference in country cultures. They also are about cultures on other planets. So literally differences in worldview. My first book is by Rumer Godden. It's Kingfishers Catch Fire. If you have not read her before, I really envy you because you're in for a real treat. She's just gold. Her prose is gorgeous. Her characters are vividly drawn, especially her children. And she maintains a fine tension throughout her books. In Kingfishers Catch Fire, a young Englishwoman, destitute, with 2 young children, decides to stay in colonial India after the death of her husband. Moving to a tiny remote village in the foothills of the Himalayas, she walks through life unaware of the consequences of her actions on the Kashmiris around her.
So does that sounds a little bit sort of E.M. Forster-ish. We're talking
Yeah.
India and clashes of cultures.
Very, very similar.
Is it?
It's very similar. That book is also on my list. But he deals with it from how colonialism engendered differences.
Right.
And she deals with it more from one woman's perspective, how her blindness makes her not see differences in socioeconomic status, in religion, in class. And in doing so, she inflames tensions that are already existing within the community, and those just erupt into conflict and violence.
What other perspectives does the author give you besides this woman's?
Well, let me give you a quote that will illustrate that. In this example, Sophie, the widow, thinks that she's being carefree, whereas the villagers see her as what she's doing as being profligate, extravagant. So, on a cold afternoon in February, in one of the small hill orchards, they found an almond tree in flower. "Flowering in the snow," said Teresa, the widow's daughter, marveling. Sophie picked 2 sprays to take into the house, but as they came through the garden, Nabir pounced on them. "You must not pick them. It's badam, almond," he said, shocked. "I know it's almond," said Sophie. "You know and you picked it?" Nabir stared at her, incredulous. The Mensahib doesn't know what it is to be poor. And that's just one example. There are tons sprinkled throughout the book. So again, that's Kingfishers Catch Fire by Rumer Godden. And Jeff, tell us about your books.
Sure, thanks. So we've been doing beach reads now for 6, 7 years, I think, and I finally decided that maybe it would be good to go back to basics. And I just picked books this year about Cape Cod, which is sort of our beach.
Can't get beachier.
Beach scene. And there's a huge, really rich array of books about Cape Cod, not only the amazing beach landscape, but also it's a rich historical area. So there's a lot to work with. There's a lot of literary connections, writers who have lived there or written about it. And plus it's local, so most of us individually as readers have some personal experience because we've spent time there and we have our own personal memories of the time that we've spent there. So my list is actually about roughly half fiction and half nonfiction, and this morning I'm going to talk about one of each. So the first one I have is called That Old Cape Magic by Richard Russo, which came out in 2009. It's not actually, for those of you who know Richard Russo, it's not actually his best known work. That's probably Empire Falls that he won the Pulitzer Prize for in 2002. But all of his novels are really well worth the time. And they can be very different from one another. He's one of those writers that he has a similar style, but each book is kind of distinctive and unique in the way, in its approach. In his own personal life, he's based in upstate New York. He's lived in Boston and Maine, and so he knows the Northeast very well and really portrays attitudes of the Northeast very well. This particular story focuses on a dysfunctional family, and I love dysfunctional family books.
Who doesn't?
I think partly because it makes me feel more well-adjusted about my own family. That's always kind of nice. So in this case, the dysfunctional family in question is that of Jack and Joy Griffin, who have a lot of ties to Cape Cod. He spent summers there when he was a kid, and they honeymooned there when they got married. And now, as the book opens, they're heading back to the Cape for the wedding of their daughter Laura's best friend. But all the way, hovering in the background of all of this, are the parents, Jack Griffin's parents. He goes by Griffin in the story. His father, he's carting his father around in the trunk of the car.
Because
He's dysfunctional.
Because he's dead, actually. Yes. Yeah, that's seriously dysfunctional.
Thank you for clarifying.
No, his father passed away, and he has the ashes, the urn with the ashes of his father, still in the trunk of the car because he has yet to come to grips with this and figure out what to do with them. So that's kind of a thing that has been going on for a while. And then there's his harridan of a mother who is very much alive and usually pestering him with annoying phone calls on his cell phone while he's driving around on the Cape dealing with what's going on. And then you flash forward a year in the story, and another wedding is taking place, and this time it's their daughter, Laura, only the wedding is taking place in Maine. And other things have happened, which is that now he's carting his mother around in the trunk of the car as well, because she has since passed away, and he's gotten no closer to resolving all of these outstanding issues with his parents. So he's got the weight of his parents had a very difficult marriage, and he's got the weight of that to process, and that, of course, brings up all of the issues in his own marriage, which is failing. And in most really good character studies, and this is one of them, I think you see a lot of the characters' problems where the past and the present are kind of fighting for dominance and working themselves out at the same time. So this book is all about those kinds of relationships. It's the whole it's a family saga, really, but it focuses on Griffin, and he's the one who's carrying around, in a sense, literally, the emotional baggage and trying to figure out what to do with it. But Russo is more than just a good character writer. He's really, he's poignant, but he's also hysterically funny at times. And I think if you've read any of them, particularly Straight Man, which is another one that I think is really good at that. Life is funny, and he really has a very good way of bringing that out. But this is not a depressing book. It's a mix of poignant and bittersweet, but also funny, and reflective and introspective at the same time. But he's really wry, and he's really witty. And actually, at the end, there's some sort of culminating events, which I can't tell you about. But they'll have you snorting your iced tea out your nose, because they're just laugh out loud funny at the end of the story. Yeah.
So what about the Cape? Is it a character? Is it?
Yes and no. That's actually a good question, because much of the action takes place on the Cape, but in a sense, Russo could have set this story anywhere. I think he chose the Cape partly because it has a strong personality as a place, and he knows it so well. So if you are familiar with Cape Cod, this is a very believable part of the story. It doesn't rise quite to the level of character, but I think what's important about it, the thing that struck me the most is that in the book, all of the family characters, they revolve around Cape Cod, but none of them ever actually lived there, so they have a different perspective on it. They spent time there, they visited there, they all come together there once a year. So it's different from a place that you live. They have a different relationship with this place, but it's still very important that it be the Cape, because it's the place they all come back to for solace and resolution in some way. So in that sense, the Cape is very much present in the story. So that's that Old Cape Magic by Richard Russo.
Great. It's almost like it's a mythic place.
It is.
Yeah.
So, Leanne, what do you have for us?
Well, my first list is called Stunning Stories, and I've done this for a few years now where I like to, it's a hodgepodge of genres, authors, kinds of different books. The thing that probably really ties them together is, of course, my hook, which is characters. Characters that I want to get to know better, characters that lead me through the book as I read it. So this particular book, which is by Heather O'Neill, is called The Lonely Hearts Hotel. It's a very quirky gem of a story. The language is gorgeous, the setting is atmospheric and seductive, and the characters, which again is always my hook, completely mesmerized me. I could not get enough of them, even the awful ones. It's a little weird, making it very hard to categorize. It's a hypnotic line between tragedy and fairy tale, I would say. It was a lot of fun, and at times it found me smiling at very odd moments because of the writing and the way the characters would come together. It takes the very worn theme of star-crossed love between two orphans, and it sort of takes your expectations and turns it on your head, which is another thing I like about a writer. It's original and an unforgettable story. It's set in Montreal and New York City for a time, but mostly in Montreal between World War I and World War II during the Depression. It's a spellbinding story, and again, there's two orphans. They're both gifted, and they fall in love with each other at very early ages. They're really, really young, and they have a very unusual magnetism and talent that allows them to sort of imagine the sensational future that they're probably going to have, and they're going to have together. The beginning of the book contains magical realism with a very bleak and ugly existence that sort of makes you wonder why you keep on reading. But you do, and one of the reasons you do is because you know that these two have got to be together and you've got to have something of a good ending. Now there's alternative side-by-side narratives that you sort of hear about as they get into their teenage years. They're pushed apart. And you hear about their very impoverished and I'd say very depraved existences to get from one point to the other. But then you just keep rooting for that happy ending that you know has to keep coming. You know it has to be there. You hope. I think that this is very reminiscent of Morgenstern's The Night Circus, which is a really hard book to do as a reader's advisory librarian because she's a wonderful writer and it's so unique. And I think that The Lonely Hearts Hotel is very unique as well. One of the things I think they have in common is that they're character-driven stories with touches of magic in the story, very magical moments. Now this author, O'Neill, fills this brilliant tragic comedy, I would call, with shady characters and allows you to step into the minds of children, prostitutes, gangsters, circus performers, and everyone else existing in this very dismal Great Depression. Now I have to say, speaking of circus performers, that there are a lot of clowns in this book. For me, that was initially problematic.
We know how you feel about clowns.
I have a problem with clowns. It goes back to my childhood. There's no reason to go into that. But the point is that what this book allowed me to do is see a variety of different clowns, men and women, I might add, as really, there's a philosophical reason for their being. They're both philosophers, wise men and women, and they express the beauty and sadness of the human condition in a way that nothing else does. And there are a lot of clowns in this book, let me tell you. Another comparison between The Night Circus and The Lonely Hearts Hotel is the writing. There are nearly too many clever similes. I'll give you an example. Horses' hooves sounded like a room full of children with hiccups.
I love that.
And the other one I really liked was their laughter was like a pheasant that burst out of a thicket. And indulge me, there's a little quote I wanted to read. She sat cross-legged on the floor and opened the book. It was filled with illustrated panels. They had onion paper that you peeled away as you would a curtain on a window to get a view of what was going on outside, or that you pulled down like a sheet from the bed to see what body was lying underneath. I mean, O'Neill has complete mastery over metaphor and imagery as she writes this book. It was bittersweet, melancholy, and complex. It was a story full of witty character dialogue and mesmerizing descriptions. It's simultaneously heartbreaking and life-affirming, and it depicts the range of human experience through the eyes of a very charismatic hero and heroine through their life together. And from the margins of the Depression to high society. It's about ambition, perseverance, desperation, heartbreak, and the very large power of love. So that is The Lonely Hearts Hotel by Heather O'Neill. And I think Jackie's going to talk a little bit more about her Discovery collection.
Speaking of weird, I feel like that word keeps coming up. The next book I want to talk about is called How to Be Human by Paula Kokoza. This is her first novel. She's a writer for The Guardian in the UK. The book takes place in London. And I chose this title in large part because it generated some of the most compelling reviews I've ever read. I strongly encourage you to read them on Goodreads if you have half an hour to kill. Readers seem to be equal parts uncomfortable and completely mesmerized. Virtually all of the reviewers agreed that she's a superb writer. The book is unique. It's completely original, but it's bizarre. So are you curious yet? So the story follows Mary, who is living in London, and she's recently gotten out of an abusive relationship. It's a long, hot summer. She's bored. She's uncomfortable, and she suddenly finds herself obsessed with a fox that she regularly sees in her garden, like a fox, like the animal fox.
On the ground
So
fox.
Mary appraises the fox as one would an attractive person. She tells acquaintances she's seeing someone, all the while thinking smugly of her fox. The book is told partially from Mary's standpoint and partially from that of the fox. So this book is truly about different perspectives, which really is what the Discovery Collection is all about. So if you enjoy literary descriptive writing and are willing to take a chance on a new writer with a slightly strange premise, How to Be Human by Paula Kokoza might be worth a try.
It's intriguing.
It's intriguing. And now we are back to...
I think we're back to me.
To Karen.
Yeah.
So the next one I want to talk about is N.K. Jemisin's The Fifth Season, which I mentioned at the beginning. And there's a quote on the front of this book from Salon.com that says, one of the most celebrated new voices in epic fantasy on it. And she is, but that quote just makes me cringe because when I see the term epic fantasy, I know what it suggests to people who don't like fantasy or think they don't like fantasy. But like the rest of the books on this list, The Fifth Season kind of defies labels. And while it's true that you probably would have to start a description of it by saying that it was some mixture of sci-fi and fantasy, I don't want to lose you completely before I start, so I'm going to explain. If I had to guess, for those of you who don't like fantasy, I would say it's probably because you have no interest in elves and fairies and dragons and magic swords and trees with eyes, right? There's none of that here. Jemisin's worlds are they're familiar enough for us to relate to in structure and character, and at the same time they're kind of brand new and formed from her amazing imagination. All of her books do contain magic, whether it's the power of a god or in this case a superhuman. And that's the reason they get the fantasy label. But I would say that these books are just as closely related as something like Margaret Atwood's speculative fiction, books that take our world and sort of ask what if, as they are to anything that we would usually call epic fantasy. So, and for you science fiction naysayers, there are no spaceships, pretty much. There are no aliens or time travel or teleportation here either. The science that she uses to tell her stories is her geological knowledge about seismic shifts and tectonic plates and earthquakes that are constant threats in this world that is the setting, this continent that is the setting for the book called The Stillness, which is ironically named because it is a place where the earth never rests and where these catastrophic seismic events called fifth seasons, the name of the book, or just seasons for short, kind of rip up the land every few centuries, every few generations. And the fifth seasons tend to wipe out all but the hardiest of humans. And then because of that, they inform so much of daily life. There are moral codes and laws that are passed down through generations that help people to kind of figure out how to survive and live through the next season. Now, having said all of that, on a much more basic level, this is an incredibly human story about three women, or two women and a girl, whose lives are all mysteriously intertwined. I'll give you just a little taste of the plot. Essen, the first woman that we meet, finds that her son has been murdered, and begins a journey to track down her daughter, who her husband has run away with. All of this happens as the catastrophes of the newest 5th season are starting to wreak havoc and be felt across the stillness. And at the same time, there's a more localized catastrophe, which, as it turns out, is turning Essen's village upside down. And it turns out, we find very, very quickly, that Essen is the reason for that catastrophe. So these series are all really good, all of the series of books that she's read, but this is by far and away the best. And the last in the trilogy is coming out in August. So if you hurry, you can read the first 2 before the next one comes out.
When you're talking about world building, I was thinking that one of the things for naysayers who don't like fiction or fantasy or science fiction is that a lot of times you need a lot of background material. Like it takes a long time to get the story started. How does she handle that?
Sometimes pages and chapters of who did this and what and why before you even get to the story. There's, again, none of that here in Jen Upson. I think her true genius is world building. She, the action and the characters start from the very first pages, and by page 50 or 100, you suddenly realize you're in this world and you don't even know how you got there, really. I mean, there is some terminology, there's some words that you have to learn along the way. She provides a glossary if you get stuck, but she just does it so seamlessly that you don't have to worry about any of that stuff, and you're just immediately immersed.
Makes it more accessible.
Yeah. Oh, totally. Yeah. Definitely action adventure from the start.
Good.
All right. Who's next?
I am.
Beth.
So my book follows very well on yours because it has a lot of similar things. Like there's some world building, and there's well, let me tell you what the book is first. The Sparrow by Mary Doria Russell, and she mixes literary fiction, science fiction, and speculative fiction, and all throughout it runs a deep philosophical question. So in that way, it's similar to yours too. In it, charismatic Father Sondes spurs a first contact mission to another planet in 2019 with 6 other explorers. But he is the only one to return in 2059, which is 40 years later, and he's only holding on by a very thin thread. So the book deals with everything from theology to love, to the arts, to friendship, to sex. And it's a physically thick book, but it also has a lot of heavy emotions, and she really balances that with a lot of love and a lot of humor. There's a lot of witty conversation. I think you were talking about that in this book. There's a lot of wit. I fell in love with all the characters. They're so achingly human. So again, just like Karen was saying, don't dismiss it because it's sci-fi. Mine does have a couple of spaceships in it, but just a couple, and they're very minimal. I wanted to mention about the world building, like Karen's books. It doesn't have a lot of time building the worlds either, because you are exploring it at the same time the characters are, because nobody's ever been there before. So she has a lot of fun creating an environment full of different creatures. And the characters in the book, like Adam in our Bible, get to name them. So you have things like turtle trees, little green guys, and Richard Nixons.
So how does she deal with the future? Because I think she wrote it in the 90s. Does she
Well, that's
give us
a good
idea
question, because she actually wrote it in 1996. So she had to deal with 2 different future times. So she had to deal with 23 years into the future and then 53 years into the future. There are no cell phones. There are, what does she call them? Note screens, which are similar to computers. The Vatican still exists, and so do countries. The Pope is a Jesuit, which at the time she wrote it was pretty unimaginable. And it was only in 2013 that we have a Pope that's a Jesuit. Human jobs are being replaced by computers, which is not so hard to imagine these days. So there's a lot of fun to explore in that, and a lot of interesting ways that she got it wrong. So that's The Sparrow by Mary Doria Russell.
I have to say that's always been it's one of my favorite books since I read it way back in 1997. I reread it for a book discussion, and it was a fabulous book discussion. It's very provocative. It just makes you think about a lot of different things. It's a book that doesn't come out of your head very easily.
It's that philosophical running through it.
Right, right.
Jackie, you want to tell us another one of your books?
Me again. So, the next book I want to talk about is Always Happy Hour by Mary Miller.
We can get behind that.
Can't we? This is a short story collection about the lives of women. It is the author's second book. Her first was critically well received, but really still qualifies as under the radar. Most of the stories in here are quite brief, 10 to 15 pages. The title story, Always Happy Hour, is a little bit longer. They're very much vignettes. They often cover just an afternoon, sometimes just an hour in a woman's life. And they have this very voyeuristic quality about them, as if you're just sort of slipping into the character's head for a few minutes. Miller is excellent at developing characters quickly and organically. Backstories are established deftly and seamlessly, just right into the narrative. Within paragraphs, you have a sense of this woman. There's not a ton of action necessarily. In one, for example, it's just a woman in her alone in her boyfriend's apartment, kind of wandering around and looking at his belongings and sort of reflecting on their relationship. Another covers a weekend in which another woman considers she's alone in her apartment again, and she's sort of comparing her life to her roommates, who has a completely different existence. The stories are all set in the South, though they're in varying locales. Some are urban, some are rural. And there's a certain kind of rawness to them, an almost uncomfortable honesty about love and relationships. Back to uncomfortable. Everything I read is very uncomfortable. But it's very modern. It's almost very millennial in the details. I think though readers of any age, particularly women, would be able to relate to the situations. The stories are sometimes a little bleak, but they're always realistic, and they're very hard to turn away from. So if you're looking for some short stories when you're on the beach to kind of dip in and out of, Always Happy Hour by Mary Miller. And we are back to Jeff.
Thank you.
At the Cape.
Yeah, so I said I was going to do one fiction and one nonfiction. So my second book is a nonfiction book, and I was originally going to talk about, I had thought I would talk about Henry Beston's book about Cape Cod, which is called The Outermost House, and that was published way back in the 1920s after he spent a couple of years living in on the beach in a small beach cottage right on the dunes, and describing his experiences on what is now Coast Guard Beach on the Outer Cape in Eastham. So the book was published in 1928 and has since become probably the natural history Cape Cod classic. The blizzard of '78 eventually destroyed the house, and it doesn't exist anymore. But I remember very distinctly a wonderful experience where I was on vacation there, and I found the exact spot where the house used to be. And I spent the whole day on the beach, just in a chair, reading The Outermost House from start to finish in the exact location where he was. It was a neat experience. But then, just by chance, another book came out that I thought actually made a better book discussion or a book talk for the spring. And this is called The Outer Beach by Robert Finch, a 1,000-mile walk on Cape Cod's Atlantic shore. The title comes from the fact that he calculated that the amount, over a series of many years, all of the walks that he did on the beaches of Cape Cod totaled approximately 1,000 miles. And I thought this would be a better recommendation because Finch, he treads very similar ground to Beston's classic. And indeed, he refers to it often because it's such a benchmark. But this book is more of our world and our time and our era and our perspective. I think it would actually be really neat to read the two of them as sort of companion pieces because they bookend a century of change from the 1920s to almost 100 years later. So I think they go together really well. Finch has actually lived in several towns on Cape Cod over the years in various different places. And so he knows his subject really, really well from firsthand knowledge, but he has really lyrical writing. This is as close to literary nonfiction as I think I've read in a while. It's actually a collection of short essays that he's written over roughly like the late 1970s up until a couple of years ago. And so it's ideal if you're actually on the beach. You can read one, go for a walk, go in the water, read another one. He's divided them from south to north, so he starts, I'll have to do my demonstration. He starts on Monomoy, which is the sand spit that comes off of where Chatham is here, and then the essays kind of slowly go up the outer cape along the national seashore until they get to Race Point in Provincetown. So this is not about the rest of the cape. It's he's really focusing on the outer beach, as it's called. There's no real requirement that you read the stories and the essays in that order, but I think it makes sense because he's kind of progressing through that. For people who really like nature writing, this is a mix of human history and its impact on nature, but he's really knowledgeable about nature. So he brings in lots of information about wildlife, especially bird life, because there's marshland, seashore, so all kinds of migratory seabirds, but also marsh birds and so forth. So if you're into that kind of thing, he goes into a lot of detail of that. I really think he beautifully captures the place and also the interaction of human and nature in a place that has seen a lot of change. It's a sandbar, after all, so change is part of the place. But it's also eternal in a certain way. And just to give you kind of an idea of the style of his writing, I thought I'd end with a quote. He says about the Cape, "We need to be overwhelmed like this on occasion by some unpeopled expanse of the land where we live, even to fear it a little, that it goes on so long without us." And that's really kind of what this is all about.
So for reader likes, is this Bill Bryson-esque, or is this something different?
A little, yes and no.
Right.
I would say if you like Bill Bryson, I definitely would suggest trying this. He delves into a place, and you all know I love books about place. The difference between them, I think, is Bryson is a bit more of a dilettante. He often is writing from the perspective of an outsider looking at a place, whereas this is obviously someone who knows it intimately inside and out. But there are a lot of similarities. Bryson's a little bit more humorous. I think he tends to see the absurdity in a lot of things, and probably more so than Finch does. But this is not a depressing book or overly introspective. There's actually a lot of really humorous and enjoyable stories about human characters, bird characters, and experiences.
Fox.
And I mean, there's no foxes. Or clowns.
All right, I might just read it then.
But I do really love the mystery, the mix of the human and the natural coming together and how they affect this place. Yeah. So, if you like Bryson, I think you would definitely enjoy it. So that's The Outer Beach by Robert Finch, and it just came out this spring.
Very good.
And on to Leanne again, I think, right?
Yes. My second list is adrenaline. I call it addictive adrenaline. So that means mystery, suspense, thrillers, all those things you read, spies and assassins and chases and wonderful things like that. And on this book that I'm talking about today, which is 2 Days Gone by Randall Silvis, certainly fits in that category. It's a skillfully written thriller set in Western Pennsylvania, and it's about Sergeant Ryan DeMarco. He's a state policeman who is coping with his own personal tragedy as he takes on a horrific case, hoping to find some answers, even though he is somewhat of a friend of the suspect. The suspect, Thomas Houston, is a writer whose novels are both popular and respected. He has a snug berth on the faculty of an English department in a college. He has a beautiful family, too. So people are saying, why did he kill them? Did he snap? And if he did, and he didn't, then why is he running? Why has he vanished? And if he's so determined to run away, why does he keep hovering around the town, calling up people and quoting poems by Edgar Allan Poe? DeMarco has a feeling that the solution to this mystery may very well be, and a key to his whereabouts for that matter, it may be in his novel in progress. So he finds the novel in progress and he starts to read it and try to figure it out. He traces the suspect's steps and delves into this half-finished manuscript, interviewing people along the way, and he starts to uncover a real tangle of lies and deceit. I wanted to book talk this because it's a unique combination of pace, character, and musings on language and fiction. It's something you don't often get in this kind of a genre. And Silvas breaks up his novel into 4 parts: drive, deception, despair, discernment. And he also, the same parts of Huston's novel within a novel. And that really made me take notice of the writing. And there's something about a damaged character. Everybody here knows that that's something that attracts me. And in this book, there are 2 damaged main characters, Hunted Thomas and Haunted Ryan, and they have very compelling stories. The book switches between 2 third-person points of view. The author's first title in this proposed series, we're thinking, is propulsive mystery. It'll just keep you turning the pages. And it surprised and intrigued me. And just when I thought it was over and I had it all figured out, I was so wrong.
So Leanne, what kind of reader would this appeal to?
Well, I think that if you like a really good suspenseful literary thriller, you will enjoy this. I think it will resonate long after it's finished. I think it's one of those books that you'll chew on a little bit, as well as enjoy the ride. It's a deft procedural, so if you like a good procedural, how to figure out how a crime is committed, this would work as well. It's also a psychological thriller. It sort of works with that because you have a lot of the workings of the mind going on. Both men in this book live very close in relationship to language. And that would be, I would think, a requirement for readers' complete enjoyment of this book. And it's a different way of looking at crime fiction. His musings, Huston's musings on language and fiction, could bog down the pace if people really want a page turner. But it's well conceived, it's very well articulated, and if you like Connolly or Penny or Lehane or any real any of the writers out there today who are churning out procedurals, you'll probably like this too. But you have to be able to deal with a very grisly description of child murder. And I have to give that up front because that's the toughest part of this book. At one point, Huston, the writer, sees himself as a character in a story he is writing, and he tells himself the same thing he repeated often to his students. Trust the process, Huston. Trust the story. This keeps him sane enough to get through, to set goals, to figure out why he is running. He is both a fiction and a truth. You are a writer and a teacher. As a writer, it is your job to make order out of disorder, to find meaning in metaphor. And as a teacher, it is your job to explain that meaning to your students. And now you are the student. Find meaning and explain it. That is your job now. And that's what he does. He tries to use his experience in fiction to try to figure out why he's in the dilemma he's in. And these literary interludes glow, and they really did glow for me. But to the restless, they may serve to weigh down the story a bit. But on the other hand, readers with patience and a taste for sumptuous language will definitely find this novel a treat. So that was Silvas's 2 Days Gone. And Jackie, I believe, has something else for us from the Discovery Collection.
This is my last one. I actually chose a nonfiction title for my last talk. It's called The Glamour of Strangeness, Artists in the Last Age of the Exotic by Jamie James. So according to Paul Bowles, a tourist travels quickly home, while a traveler moves slowly from one destination to the next. In The Glamour of Strangeness, Jamie James describes a third species, those who roam the world in search of the home they never had in the place that made them. So this book is about 6 artists who were part of this group. He calls it sort of this lost national school. These people who left their homes in search of the exotic and the unknown. So it's 6 little mini biographies. There's one about a devastatingly handsome German painter who remade his life in Bali, a Javanese painter who found fame in Europe, a Russian-Swiss writer who roamed the Sahara dressed as an Arab man. She was a woman. An American experimental filmmaker who went to Haiti and became a committed follower of voodoo. Paul Gauguin is perhaps the most famous one, the French painter who set sail for Tahiti. There's a naval doctor, poet, and novelist who immersed himself in classical Chinese civilization in imperial Peking. The subjects really run the gamut from eccentric to bizarre to downright crazy, which really adds kind of a surprising element of humor. Maya Deren, who was the voodoo lady, was arguably completely unhinged. I mean, off the rails. But she's fascinating. Her story is really interesting. So these little mini biographies, there's 6 of them, and they're very accessible. The author was a travel writer in a past life, so he's very good at writing in this sort of non-textbookish way. It's erudite without being terribly academic. There's also this fabulous supporting cast of characters who are, because they're true stories, real people. So Charlie Chaplin, Noel Coward, Henri Rousseau, Queen Victoria, they all make an appearance. My one criticism is that the various stories don't necessarily come together in any kind of cohesive conclusion. This element of exoticism is really all that kind of ties them together in the end. But because the essays are so descriptive and so entertaining and so well written, it's pretty easy to kind of forgive him not having this tightly wrapped conclusion. They're good on their own, and again, like with Always Happy Hour, the short stories, you could just read one of these, here and there. It looks longer than it is because there are lots of notes, so you could just pop into it when you want to. So again, this was The Glamour of Strangeness: Artists in the Last Age of the Exotic by Jamie James.
Very good, very good. I think that we have time to talk a little bit about our lists. Jackie, why don't you start?
The one I would really point out from my list is just won the Booker International Prize. So it's a new prize. I think they created it a couple of years ago. That they give out in June, and it's by David Grossman, and it's called A Horse Walks into a Bar, and it's translated from Israeli, actually. He was an Israeli writer. And it's about a comedian, and the whole book takes place kind of in real time over, I think it's like just a couple hours. And it's basically him bombing. and
how uncomfortable.
How that goes. So yeah, just won a prize. So it was really kind of what we were going for with the Discovery Collection.
I'm reading it as we speak, and you're absolutely right. It's cringeworthy, but in a really good way.
Okay, that makes sense. Very good. Thank you, Jackie. Jeff?
I'll just quickly mention 2. Again, my list is a mix of fiction and nonfiction. If any of you have never read The Big House by George Howe Colt, it's a perfect summer read. Colt is married to Anne Fadiman, who's an extremely famous writer in her own right. And The Big House is all about, it's nonfiction, it's about his actual family home, which is this massive Victorian pile down, I think it's actually in part of Falmouth. And it's just a chronicle of the experience of the family, almost told from the perspective of the house. And all of the people who've come and gone in it, and it's just a wonderful family saga because it's real. And I think even if you don't have a gigantic house on the Cape, you all have some kind of memory of what that's like to go away with your family and hang out on the beach. But it's the history of the construction of the house, how people grew up in it, and how they interact with it. It's just delightful. And the other one I'd also mention is The Orphans of Race Point, which is fiction. And that's a book that Leanne recommended, and I think book talked a couple of years ago. And I have it on my list because it does take place on the Cape, and it's a fantastic character study. It's powerful and moving, and I read it only because Leanne told me to.
Sometimes I'm right.
She was absolutely right. So I'm adding my voice to hers and saying, if you didn't believe her, believe me, you must read that book.
Right, and I think you could live at any beach and find that that's part of your, part of the character study. But I think Race Point is. Yeah. And the same thing with the Big House.
Did you read that one?
I did, and we did it as a discussion for one of my book groups, and it was terrific because that house is a character.
Absolutely.
In such an amazing way.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So Beth.
Following on Jeff, The Big House, his wife, Anne Fadiman, is on my list. And that's The Spirit Catches You and Then You Fall. And it's about it's a nonfiction book, and it's the intersection between Western medicine and a Hmong family whose daughter has epilepsy, and she really does a great job of talking about both sides, how they work together and how they don't work together. And the second book I want to mention is Lincoln and the Bardo by George Saunderson.
Saunders.
Saunders, sorry.
That's it.
And that's a new book, came out this year, and it takes place when Lincoln's son Willie is interred. And there are spirits in the grave, and the Bardo is like limbo. So it's what takes place there and how the characters live and what happens with Lincoln. It's really wonderful book. You read it, right?
No, I haven't, but Jeff
Oh.
has.
I read it, and it's mind-boggling.
Yeah, it's really wonderfully done.
I guess it's been optioned for film rights, and I can't even imagine how they're going to do
curious.
it.
Well, part of it is that
it's almost experimental in the structure.
He puts in bits of history in it.
Yeah.
So there's quotes that are really historical, and then there's this other world.
It's an amazing book.
And I have the audio I'm going to listen to because the audio reviews have been off the charts, just because there's a voice for each individual, no matter, and there's like over 256 characters. So, I'm looking forward to that. I have to experience it that way. Anyway, Karen.
Well, speaking of film rights and audio, I just wanted to put in a plug for Neil Gaiman's American Gods, which I mentioned at the very beginning, which is one of the books that engendered this list. I listened to that, and it was actually the 10th anniversary edition of the book, which they let him put a bunch of things back into that he had to take out when he wrote it the first time because they weren't sure what kind of whether it was going to sell or not. And of course, it sold madly. And the audio is a full cast of fully. There's an actor for each part instead of some one person reading it. So it's a full cast of characters, and it's amazing. Really great audio. And of course, they have made that now into a TV series, so which apparently is supposed to be quite good. So Neil Gaiman's American Gods, the audio version, is my plug.
Oh, very good. That's great. I have a couple of lists, as I said, and I want to mention the fact that on the Stunning Stories list, Louise Miller's The City Baker's Guide to Country Living, I thought was just a lovely. If you want a very sweet story that you can just settle down to on the beach, this is truly one of the true beach reads on my list, I think. It's about a very talented chef who gets into all sorts of trouble in her life in the city and decides that she needs to run away for a while in Vermont. And she works for this little inn. And one of the things that really, really got me about this book was great character, of course, as you know, is a hook, but you smell the pastries baking and you can hear the music in the story. The writer does a great job with that. So that was a fun, sweet book that I think might appeal to a variety of people. And as far as the adrenaline goes, there's a lot of things on this list that I can speak about, but the one I want to really talk about is The Girl Before by J.P. Delaney, which has two very unreliable narrators, which everyone knows is really a thing with me. Truly well done. It happens to be a male writer writing two female voices that is just astonishing. And it has a past character and a current character and what happens in this particular architectural abode that they live in, and the architect involved in creating it. It's hard to describe, but really well done, and it's one of those twisty-turny endings that really, you think you figured it out, and then there's this little arc that just goes, really? It was wonderful. It was really wonderful. And I listened to that. That was a good listen.
So you were wrong twice then.
Yes, this happens occasionally. It does. So, yes. So, and I just want to say, really shout out about the Discovery Collection in the sense that I picked up a book of essays by Lindy West called Shrill, and they were wonderful. And I don't think I would have actually noticed it because I don't do a lot of nonfiction peeking, as we know, because I don't have time as fiction queen. And I've been thoroughly enjoying them. So it's like, that's a great place to discover something that you don't expect. So thank you for joining us. Thank you guys. It was a lot of fun. I want to remind everybody that you can get the lists at www.wakefield.org, wakefieldlibrary.org, excuse me, at the Beebe Library's website. And we have a lot of lists waiting for you with the display that is at the library that will be there all summer, so you can find all the books on our list and everything we've talked about. Thank you.